Welcome to episode 7 of the Deciphering Software Modernisation podcast. And today I'm, of course, back with you. Sam, by the way, for those of you who don't know. We also have Francesco.
Hello, Sam. Nice to be here.
Francesco, welcome back. We have Maciej.
Yeah, hello everyone.
And of course, we have our new guest, Christina. Do you want to tell everyone a bit about yourself?
Hi everyone, thanks for inviting me. My name is Christina. I've worked with Codurance now for just over 5 years with various projects, and prior to that I've spent about 8 years working in sort of like different areas within the industry, mostly telecoms actually, but yeah. Nice,
excellent. Well, we're happy to have you joining us today, Christina. And today we want to talk about refactoring. Is our main subject. We'll see where the conversation goes. But one thing I thought we could start with is what does refactoring? What do we define the definition as? And so, refactoring. Francesco, I'm gonna go with you.
Refactoring is that thing that when you say you're doing it, then the project manager says, "Don't do it," right? Like, do it later. I think in the context of software modernization, we could say refactoring is the thing we are doing, right? We have a piece of old code, a system that is working but is in bad state, that is hard to change, and we want to make it easier, safer, cheaper to change. I believe that's like the thing that we're thinking about when we say refactoring in this context.
You are right. In the context of software modernization, it is maybe a slight nuance, because there might be times where you might actually change you might slightly tweak how the software works. Of course, you might discover a bug, etc., etc. But I think refactoring is probably one of the most misused terms in our industry. Someone's like, "Oh, I just got to refactor this," and they've actually just changed how everything works.
But yeah, it's when in software modernization is where we get the real value. Because we start with legacy code, we start with a system that everyone is scared to touch. And after refactoring, we end up with a system that is not just valuable, but also modifiable, changeable.
I would also add actually that if you come to that point, probably, you missed the mark a bit, right? So because usually you have to be doing refactoring all the time. You shouldn't wait for like a full-blown modernization project and everything. I mean, a lot of the time that is the case, but ideally, as part of business as usual, there should be some refactoring as part of the work, right? So, but as we all know, business as usual most of the time wins. So a lot of the time there is a need for the like full-blown modernization initiatives, right? But it's usually should be something it's parts of your everyday work, regardless what you are doing. And I guess if it's software engineering, platform engineering, it's the same thing, right? Improving the area around your current work, basically, always.
Interesting though, yeah, we brought the distinction between sort of that continual refactoring that, as you said, Maciej, you should be doing all the time, versus software modernization, where maybe it's a bit of a larger effort. It's a much bigger hammer, should we say? you're taking to, not that you're breaking the software, but it's a much bigger and impactful tool that you have to. It's a much more concerted effort you need to take with it. I was wondering, like, what do you guys think is a recipe for, in the context of software modernization? What should be in that recipe to make sure that refactoring is effective? How can you set it up for success?
I think having a sort of like clear stated goal and understanding of a boundary of what you want to work on, because obviously with refactoring, especially with large legacy systems, there is a huge amount that you can do, and you can be mired down for years just in the simple act of trying to make code better. But I think having a stated goal or an outcome as a starting place, at least, is a very good beginning point, at least.
And making sure that the area within that boundary is valuable to the customer. like making refactoring areas that are not that don't need change or they're not valuable is just really a waste.
It's if code hasn't changed in 10 years, then the impact of your refactoring isn't going to be much. I mean, if it's still working now, right?
So maybe in terms of what critical areas would be best suited initially, at least, right? And then depending what the stakeholder reacts, maybe that's enough, maybe that refactoring is enough to help him, her achieve their business goals, whatever it is, like better agility or some cost optimization. But usually refactoring everything, a legacy system, is probably not a good idea. Maybe there are situations where that is necessary, but usually like starting at least with the most critical bits is probably the best trade-off, I guess.
We've seen a couple of tools in the past. Remember, one is called Codescene, I can't remember the other one, that analyze the past changes to identify combination of places in the software where there is high complexity and a lot of change at the same time. Those are called the hotspots, and like working on those probably a good start.
And also you can identify the relationships between changes in the software. When this part changes, this part tends to change as well. Then you can start to see relationships as well to get that sort of map of where to change. But it's a good point. The hotspots can help you pinpoint maybe where those areas that are changing quite a lot, and also do have quite a bit of technical debt as well associated with them. That obviously hasn't been paid down because that's why it has the accumulation of debt. One thing I was interested to talk about was maybe what we spoke a bit about the things that maybe set up a successful refactoring. Christina, you mentioned about having the clearly stated goal. I guess to flip it slightly, what would then be the red flags for a refactoring? Where you would then say, maybe you might want to reconsider spending time refactoring this part of the project.
I guess one of the things might be potentially if the goal is just refactor a specific area, let's say, and without trying to spread that knowledge of how to refactor in general the system, or at least use that refactoring knowledge how to write new code, for example. Right? So if it's only refactor this, but we keep doing the stuff the old way, the new features, that might be a red flag. It should be a bit more, right? It's a lengthy process. It's a complex process. So let's take advantage so that we also try to share that refactoring knowledge. So that's what is the state-of-the-art way of doing new features within the system, let's say. So it's maybe not a red flag, but just something to keep in mind, right? And remind the stakeholder that it won't be like a long-lasting benefits if that won't be considered. That's at least my opinion.
I guess two things that might point out that the effort is better spent elsewhere might be if it's not possible yet to ensure the safety of the area, like they are not changing the behavior. I guess see the previous podcast on Golden Master. And the other thing could be if instead there are big difficulties releasing, also that might be an indication that the effort might be also spent downstream of the software development to facilitate changes. But it's it's not like you don't have a problem. Like you should not refactor. Is maybe do something else first.
Of course, there is obviously the big one that Christina mentioned. So if someone hasn't come with a clear stated goal or objective, and they're just saying, let's refactor system X, that potentially is a red flag. Or you might to dig more into why they suggested that as a candidate as well, because there might be a reason there. It's just not came to the surface right away.
So one of the things is what I saw is the business trying to make the developers 10-15% of the time devote to refactoring. And I don't mean refactoring along the place where I'm developing new things, but to the proper refactoring. And that is just not enough. They go back to their business as usual, and that modernization effort, really, to be honest, kept the code at this point is just not getting out of the ground. So it's something to be worry about when you talk to your stakeholders, like how this thing should be conducted, let's say.
Yeah, I think there's an importance there. There's also like a sort of almost a clash of cultures at that point, because you have people who work on the refactoring specifically, and at the same time you might have developers that are doing everything in the old way, and that ends up causing a big clash, especially if there's like a concerted modernization effort in some area of a code base that is, for example, having features consistently developed by a separate team. You might find that it at that point it might feel like it's not ready to even be worked on, because that clash needs to be sorted out almost. You need to be able to make the efforts and also ensure that they are maintained at the same time, to improve, at least the efforts to improve the code.
Isn't that sort of an inevitability? Like if the area is valuable and needs changes, then there will be people working on it at the same time as it's being modernized.
I think that's true. I think my concern there is more around the types of efforts. Of course, you can do new development and then be sort of like holistic or care about the code whilst you're doing so. Make sure you're, doing your TDD cycles, trying to fit in code well, or you can, kind of go against the efforts of the people who are currently trying to improve upon that area of code, and say, well, I'll be just going to wedge this new if-else branch at the end of this big flow, and then you're kind of working against each other now, and I think that maybe is a risk, or maybe a small red flag or something in that kind of effort.
So I guess you're saying, like, in terms of right at the beginning of refactoring, the consideration is, well, who's touching the code? Because there's as much you need to take the code on a journey as you need to take everyone who works on it on a journey, and make sure that you can work harmoniously and decide what are the ways of working that you're going to adopt to make sure that both sides can do their work, but not start butting heads and, oh, you changed this thing, or where's this bit of code gone that was there yesterday, or it's definitely a good point. I feel we're on the precipice of talking about different techniques of refactoring, because maybe what we're talking about here as well is different techniques might be useful in certain situations, and obviously the makeup of the organization, people who are changing the code, is obviously important. Although we say refactoring, and when we say it, we're quite deliberate in what we mean by refactoring. As I said, some people misuse the term and say, we're refactoring this, refactoring that, and they're not actually refactoring, they're actually changing the behavior quite considerably. And they use sort of refactoring as a synonym for change, which is not the case. And so one thing I want to talk about is, specifically in software modernization, there's also this interesting scenario where, although it's a very deliberate choice that you are refactoring, you may uncover things that behaviors that are maybe bugs, etc., that need to be changed. And so maybe even though the core behavior, although even that might change depending on the bug, the core behavior maybe is the same, you may still at some level be changing the behavior because you've spotted something that's not quite right. What do you guys think about that in your experience, in terms of having to make some changes after identifying that something's not quite right?
So fixing bugs when the opportunity that arises, not the opportunity, when we become aware of them, is the right thing to do. But I think of the two techniques that I have in mind, one is better suited for that, because it leaves a single working copy of the software. But this goes then into the techniques again. But yeah, on a sort of more abstract level, you are refactoring something, meaning changing the implementation without changing the behavior. You become aware of a bug. Fixing the bug, I think, 99% of the time is the right thing to do, unless some business process depends on that. And usually, I think the reason is that you become aware of that because the implementation is simpler if you don't have the bug. So you do the more obvious things, and then you notice a behavior change. An example I have in mind is, like, counting and filtering when it's not implemented in the usual way of doing the filtering first and counting later. When it's not implemented that way, then you will find out when you implement it in the most logical way. Fixing the bug, almost always the right thing to do. You have to find a technique that allows for that.
Yeah, I would just add that it's good. And this just comes to show how important it is that constant collaboration with the delivery team that is working around the area. So that's through that constant communication and us, like the modernization team, showing the progress and maybe some doubts about the certain area. Is this actually a bug? Because sometimes the legacy code is something which usually seems to be a bug, maybe actually a weird feature that they implemented at some point. So it's good to have that constant collaboration and that delivery team, or also maybe the QA as well, like from the functional perspective. Seems to be a bug, but maybe actually that's a functionality that is expected. So I think it's important that collaboration with the people that work with that and are working in that area also, because usually a modernization team is most likely will not be familiar to the same degree as those specific cross-functional teams or delivery teams.
I think it's interesting as well that the fixing bug process, sort of like the current project I have, has a very large suite of golden master tests, and as Francesco says, refactoring sort of to the simpler solutions has, on a lot of occasions, caught us out in ways that we didn't expect. Thinking, well, actually, this should have worked, and some small change. But yet, certainly, constant communication with stakeholders has helped us a lot in that respect. And there are certainly a few cases now where I think had the software been developed with different development styles, and say mutation testing had been used or something like that, that the solution initially provided would have been quite different. But certainly, I think that some of those bugs that we have seen or we have found have turned out to be maybe more of a hidden feature in the end. In our discussions with stakeholders of like, oh, we didn't expect that, but now that's something that is almost relied upon, or that would now be expected behavior.
Yeah, there's some really good points in there for sure. Definitely around constant communication with stakeholders, but also, as you said, like having that safety net that Francesco already said this. We've talked about this in previous sessions, but having a safety net in the first place is absolutely paramount, really, to be able to make some meaningful changes. We are, as you said, Francesco, we are getting close to talking about the two different techniques, or a few different techniques. So I think let's dive into it, and we can talk about the nuances and we can compare them as well. I guess the two I'm thinking of are in-place refactoring versus sort of the more Strangler pattern, or what's I think Martin Thaler recently has renamed it to Strangler Fig. But for the purpose of this conversation, we can call it the Strangler pattern. But yeah, the idea, I guess, does anyone want to talk briefly give an overview of them, or their differences, and then we can dig into each of them?
I think the key difference is if you're going to have a single copy of the code or two parallel implementations. So with the Strangler, you would have two implementations that run in parallel, one being completed over time that will then at some point be replacing the previous one. That would be the Strangler Fig. While the other, the in place, is where you keep a single implementation and changing bit by bit. Like you change it, you make little changes to it over time, and you are left with a single copy all the time. I think those are the two sort of the key difference between the two approaches.
The multiple versions can then become even worse if you chuck in, say, multiple branches as well, because then you have multiple versions that potentially across multiple branches, etc. Which then maybe
you mean like Git branches?
Sorry, yes, yeah, exactly. So yes, so then you could get even worse because if you have the copies of the code on the same branch, but then you have several branches related to that branch, then you then have several more copies than you thought you did of the software, if you see what I mean. Assuming they're
God,
long-lived branches.
my head is hurting now.
Yeah, but anyway, for the purpose of this conversation, we'll just assume that we're talking about main or master, a single branch, just to keep it simple. But yeah, I mean, maybe I just want to start talking about, I guess, Strangler Fig, because one of the problems I see with it, I'm not saying this is why you shouldn't go with it, but one of the problems I see is that because you have these two versions, at some point, someone somewhere has to make a decision to effectively flip the switch, right? And say we're currently going down this branch of the code, and now we're going to go to the other one. And I guess I don't know what your guys' thoughts are on that, in that someone has to make that decision and has to have the confidence that you don't just keep these two things basically in the code base, but you're always just using the option A and you're never actually flipping the switch to option B.
I suppose there's a benefit to that. With the fact that it is a sort of like a switch or whatever mechanism you choose to do, so you can kind of go for a sort of staggered release option to minimize the risks of those changes, right? So in some senses, being able to say roll that out to one less not less important client, but maybe more like a collaborative client or something like that, someone who is willing to work with you on the new release, you can minimize the risks of sort of deploying that to everyone at once, right? So there is some benefits to that, and you've also obviously got the rollback ability of being able to say, hey, well, we've moved you over, we've identified some problems, we're moving you straight back to the legacy.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a natural safety, safety version of refactoring, I guess, right? Because I mean, the legacy version is still running until you modernize, refactor the entire flow, let's say, for example, right? So that's, I guess, the safer version. If you trying to refactor, there's a list of things that would say go for Strangler is like a critical area, or when the stakeholder is very cautious about this refactoring thing that he doesn't understand yet, and she would like to be it's like a proper safety net, right? So if we roll it out, it's been very well tested and verified, and if something goes wrong, it's a simple switch, 1 second, and we're back to the legacy version, right? But there are a lot of cons as well, right? The main one being is that it takes a while to modernize an entire chunk of an application or workflow, for example, because usually, if it's a critical part, there's usually some kind of new features added or some BAU being performed on it. And you need to keep always updating that refactoring Strangler branch with those newest changes. So there's a lot more effort, I guess, in refactoring, right? Because you always have to, it's like trying to change a wheel going 100 miles an hour during the highway, right? So that's kind of a refactoring effort. But in the end, it's safer. It's all about trade-offs.
I suppose one of the trade-off is how fast do you get feedback on the changes you have done. I suppose with a Strangler pattern, until you turn on the feature flag for the first time, you're not going to get any feedback from production of how well is your change performing, how well is your refactoring performing. You will not find out until the end, until you're done with that part.
That's true. There are ways that you can potentially still get feedback, though, because I've seen it before where, again, it depends where you sort of have the flag, so to speak, whether we're talking about the flag is in the code and there's an actual branch, like if-else branch effectively, or maybe it's at the network layer. But what I've seen before is where you had two systems, and this was actually creating a newer version of a system, and basically it was done at the network where you could then send the same traffic to the new application, and then you would then get back the response from the current one, the new one, and then you could then compare and contrast the differences between them. So I guess a form of like almost like on the fly golden master sort of comparison test.
It's
but
like a
you are right.
shadow. It's like a shadow deployment in
Yeah.
some way, right? So
Yeah,
where
exactly.
also every other request or some request you send to that other implementation, but it's transparent to the user, but it's useful for your
Yep.
testing verification. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I do agree that the feedback tends to be a lot less, as you said, Francesco. And as you said earlier, actually, with the testing becomes a bit more. Sorry, not the testing. The bug fixing becomes maybe a bit more involved because, as you said, you have these two different versions. You have say your current branch, and then you have your new branch that you're building up. And then it's a case of, well, how are you going to fix the bugs? You need to then do it in two places, etc., etc. So yeah, but as you said, it's a lower risk thing for stakeholders as well. Until obviously you have to flick the switch, but it becomes a bit more of an organized effort, should we say, managing these two versions of the software. So what about the other one? In place, and we keep going back and forth because there'll be things we talk about that will for sure be interesting to draw comparisons between the two. But in place, I guess you don't have this thing I mentioned where you sort of this, I need to flick the switch, but then equally you don't have you may have other rollback mechanisms, but you don't necessarily have what Christina was on about, where you can then just roll back to, okay, let's flick the switch back and go down the other branch of the code. You could for sure have other rollback mechanisms. Maybe you revert the change that you've just done, but you don't necessarily have that same safety net, should we say?
Yeah, I think the thing with in-place refactoring is that you do get the immediate feedback. Obviously, you know, for example, your golden master test suite is still passing. You've got essentially the same features, but I think that there does come a level of cumulative risk where you are making changes and you make them over an extended period of time, and then later on you find something is wrong, and pinpointing what has changed over that cumulative bundle of changes then becomes quite difficult.
So you specifically referencing Strangler Fig technique, or are you saying with regards to in place?
I'm thinking more in terms of in place refactoring. I think there is that cumulative risk that you have there. You know, you might have introduced some breaking change that is only breaking for, say, one or two clients. You don't notice it. The golden master suite of tests didn't quite cover it, and you've made a bunch of in place refactoring changes. I think that you've kind of committed after some point, right? Because of the way that you've been pushing consistently.
Yeah, although I suppose you're more, I don't know, my view is you're probably more likely to spot it with in place than you are with the Strangler Fig. Like I would say you're maybe more likely to spot it sooner, but it depends, right? Because it depends what do you have in place in terms of testing, what's the safety net.
I think it also depends on how quickly do you actually get feedback from production. We can imagine making a very, very, very small change, deploying it and getting feedback, but we are imagining a system where a single change can get out to production easily, and then we can monitor and get feedback from the system. If that's not true, then there is this cumulative effect of, you're making small changes, but what really goes out and you get feedback on is not just one of those, but all of them combined over a period of time. Then yes, it becomes harder to get feedback. You still have the delayed feedback, not because of how you made the changes, but how they get deployed.
Maybe in terms of one of the pros of using this pattern in place is the benefit for the delivery teams, because you refactor in place, you merge it, and basically each sprint, or ideally even more often, they have a fresh area of code that is refactored, and they see that and they can use that as a blueprint, let's say, for how they should be working, that they should be developing their code, or maybe them doing also those small refactorings, as now they see how you did it, instead of waiting for this big bang, Strangler pattern merge, at the end of the process, let's say, which usually the delivery teams, they won't see it unless that is done to the end. I mean, they maybe sneak around your branches, for example, but usually they won't see it properly and be able to work with it until it's properly merged.
it's a good point, because they're probably still working on the version A, whereas we were on version D, and then they're not necessarily, although as you say, they can have a look at it and they might say, "Oh, this is how you do that." I'll be inspired by that. But yeah, it's a good point. But it does come back to what you were saying as well, Francesco, around feedback, because obviously either solution could suffer from that feedback loop. But I guess it depends where you put your changes as well. What I mean is at what level you put that if else, basically, because there might be certain parts of the application where maybe you could put them deeper in the code, should we say, versus high level. Because obviously you can have a high level, go to my new thing or my old one. There might be parts that potentially, depending on how the system is broken up, you could potentially start introducing some changes and start flicking the switch sooner than earlier in development. But depending on the scale of what you're trying to effectively change, that might not be realistic. So in place should give you quicker feedback, even if the feedback loop from production is a bit slower than maybe than the ideal scenario.
I think the rule of thumb, like the wisdom that I've seen so far when it comes to Strangler, is to put the feature flag, like the if that decides between the two implementation, as early as possible in the user workflow. So rather than being deep in the system and so defining a smaller area that can be completed quicker, I've seen as an approach to put the feature flag very early on, like as soon as the request enters the application. I mean, there's nothing in theory wrong with a different approach that delimits a smaller area and puts the feature flag there. It's just I haven't seen it in practice. I don't have experience with that. But
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, delimit a smaller area. You sort of have a middle of the road approach between the two, potentially faster feedback and still the safety. It sounds like a good approach.
Yeah.
I think
Francisco
at one point, like also we did consider that also either that, like, although it's at the top level of the user flow, right? It's still, we consider that maybe there's a specific start with a specific combination of request params or inputs. And if that's the case, then it goes to the Strangler one. If it's the other case, which is the most ones, it goes to legacy, but still you start with something that is like on the top level, but like partial thing that you can actually merge, but still call it like refactoring using the Strangler.
Yeah, I remember that. That was an interesting approach. Yeah, the idea was you receive a request, and if the request is within certain parameters, so it's sort of a simple one, then go to the new implementation. And it was sort of splitting. It was not an on-off switch. It was some of the requests that can be served by this new implementation will go to the new implementation. It was an interesting approach.
So complex and be very cautious. Like
so a bit complex.
If you try this at home, folks, just be cautious. So yeah,
I guess the same advice goes for trying to change your tire at 100 miles on the highway as well. They try that at home. What do you think in terms of from like a stakeholder point of view? We briefly alluded to it in terms of them having to flick a switch. What do you think the perception differences are in terms of stakeholder perception between in place, i.e. you're all working on the same code, versus Strangler Fig?
It's an interesting point. I've actually been working in an in-place refactoring project for the last couple of years, and certainly, at least the client's perspective in my project was that they didn't like long-lived feature branches, and I think that's sort of like sometimes a side effect of maybe doing something like a Strangler, but depending on really on how you do choose to do your merging anyway. And that was a strong part of the reason why we ended up going the avenue of doing in-place refactoring. So certainly they had a somewhat negative perception of that. Whether that was unfounded or not, I guess it's a different matter.
An assumption I would have about in-place from the point of view of the stakeholder is the ability to, at least in some areas, start doing changes cheaply and safely. Is that true? Is that real? Because it's just my assumption at this point.
So is there an assumption that you can do it cheap and safe in place, or that you can't?
Well, no, is that the idea would be this. If I do in-place refactoring, I will, after a certain amount of time, have some area of the code that are sort of new. They're no longer legacy, right? And now I can change those areas. So it's like there's a team that is doing the modernization. An area of the code is now modernized. Other teams can now contribute to those areas and do changes safely and cheaply. Is that a true assumption, or based on your experience?
I think that would be a fair assumption. I don't know that I've had that experience of other teams coming in and changing code necessarily cheaply. I think so far we've managed to avoid overlaps to some extent in that respect. Certainly, I've had comments from client developers that they have mentioned that code is easier to understand, so that part at least is a win in that respect. So hopefully, they can see different ways of going forward on their side a bit quicker, because it's the code base that they currently work on.
And that's actually what the stakeholder wants to see, right? That let's say the new features are developed in faster and better way, and that refactoring helps in the way that the code they're working on this refactor is better, but also they know how to not to write code, so that is instant legacy as well, and it usually takes longer to develop. So yeah, that's like an instant win for the stakeholder as well, because usually business agility it's always on their list of things to see as benefits from modernization. So
yeah, it's a good point, because it's like that kind of cost saving, I suppose, like the fact that they can be more efficient because the code is easier to read and change, and they're not spending lots of time trying to understand what the code is, how can I make my change, etc., etc. Yeah, it makes sense. A random question, and I've never seen this, but what is it possible that there would be a hybrid approach where you could do a bit of both in place and Strangler? I'm not saying necessarily at the same time, but because when Francesco was talking and saying how you do the in place for a period of time, I was thinking, is there a point at which you could combine the approaches?
To be honest, like before I joined Codurance, like the only way I was doing is the inline, and I had my little like golden hammer approach for it, let's say, that I use almost for everything, which is the way of doing it Michael Feathers pointed out in the Working with Legacy Code book, which is he called it the sprout method. So you'd take a small chunk of, let's say you have 500 lines of huge method, right? There's just no way to like quickly refactor that. But you can find some cohesive units within that, and you can try to extract that as separate classes. And in the legacy part, you just inject that class or something like this. So it's not like a Strangler where, like Francesco mentioned, it's good to start like from the like user journey, top perspective. Here is like you maybe walk away from the inside, but still with larger chunks, which then you can use the legacy until you have that extracted class modernized and refactor, which should take a lot less time than the proper Strangler of a user journey, let's say. So this is something much that was my golden hammer basically, and still is, I guess, in some way. So that I like to use.
I look forward to your book coming out, Maciej, on the golden hammer technique, where you explain exactly how.
I think to some extent we have done that in our project. At least we do have some parallel implementations of services that are used by vast swathes of the project. We have required to do sort of like refactoring, try and modernize for example, the way that we do database calls, but those are deep within functions that are utilized by many flows of an application. And in those cases, we can sort of put those things behind an interface such that the flows that we use kind of end up going into a parallel implementation of that interface. And I guess on a smaller scale, in the sense that we've like sort of provided like a similar like facade, I guess, for those two flows, that does work in a much smaller sense, like similar to the way the Strangler pattern does also.
Yeah, but still you can add those feature flags as well, or feature toggles as well. But definitely be wary not to keep them for long, right? It's a shorter lifespan for those feature toggles, definitely. Yeah, but I think you can do it actually. Like if you start from the inside, right? It's just be wary of those feature flags as well, so that they do not explode too much, let's say, and you forget about them and removing them. So yeah, that's another maintenance.
I guess that's a good point as well, Maciej, you raised actually, because if you were, say, modernizing different parts of their system at the same time, and say Strangler Fig was employed in multiple areas, you then end up with multiple versions, admittedly in different parts of the software. It's not just the same version, but you need to be careful, as you say. The goal is to, at some point, switch it over so you just are on one version again, and you don't want to necessarily keep the whatever. Even if you just have one modernization effort and you're doing a refactoring in system X, you still want to make sure that you aren't keeping those versions open for a long period of time.
It sounds quite terrifying, the idea of 5 different areas with 5 different feature flags. You start getting into the sort of like infinite realms of possibilities of your application. Like which combination are we running today?
That's true. Because then you sort of get the combinatorial complexity maybe as well, that you have those different combinations and do they play nicely together, etc., etc. But that maybe is a topic for another time. And
then you need one person to just to manage that, right?
Yeah,
the feature flag manager, and it's
I'd quite enjoy that title, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, I think, to be honest, I didn't even talk about branching, and I said I wouldn't. But that is another topic that could feed into that as well, where you start talking about managing it sort of at scale as well. But yeah, I mean, I've had a great time today talking about this, and I'm sure there's plenty more we could talk about it as well, as we sort of alluded to just now. But I sort of wanted to get around just what are your main takeaways, and I'm gonna do it in reverse. So, Maciej, what's your main takeaways from today's discussion?
Be very transparent and clear with your stakeholder, I guess, before you make that decision, and also don't think that whatever you choose will be you have to do till the end of the modernization. You may use different techniques for different areas as well. So always have that in mind and be transparent with your stakeholder. What are the pros and cons and the trade-offs?
For me, it's mainly really that one approach doesn't fit everything. So there is a lot of different ways that we can choose to target our refactoring, and that really is dependent on, I guess, the development teams and us, and the needs of our stakeholder, really.
2 takeaways for me. One is the importance of targeting, like choosing the right target. And the second is this balance for the stakeholder between the perceived safety, but also the earlier returns from the investment of the in place.
Thanks, Francesco. You took one of the ones I was going to say, which is this sort of I guess balance between upfront when you think about refactoring, and you might think, this one is safer, but then of course there's the trade-off between one that maybe is safer, but then are you going to flip the switch later on down the line? What's going to give you confidence to do that, etc. And these are all considerations for a modernization team to work at as well and work hard at, because if say you do go for the Strangler Fig, you're going to have to put some effort potentially into convincing someone that it offers like parity, feature parity with what's currently there. And so, yeah, a lot of work has to go into that. Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone. To everyone watching or listening, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And let us know your feedback and any questions you have. And yeah, I guess until next time, thank you very much, everyone, and see you soon.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.